After my left me 3 times, I married another, and she begged me to come back. Eliza, would you come with me? The wedding hall fell into complete silence. As I stood there stunned, with the ring halfway onto Eliza Monroe's finger, her long-lost love, Julian Hart, stood up yet again, shouting across the room at her. Eliza, I'm here to take you away. Will you come with me? Without a moment's hesitation, Eliza pulled her hand away from mine, lifted her dress, and walked gracefully toward Julian. Tears glistened in her eyes, filled with an emotion I hadn't seen before, as if Julian were the one she was meant to marry today. And there I stood, the actual groom under the glaring spotlight, reduced to nothing more than a clown in a suit. With conviction, Eliza extended her hand to Julian, her voice ringing loud and clear for everyone to hear. Julian, I will. It couldn't be more evident. Eliza Monroe, the woman I loved, had been swept away by her long-lost love, Julian Hart. But I didn't feel angry. Instead, there was a strange sense of inevitability. After all, this was the 3rd time in a month that my wedding had been interrupted by Julian. I let the ring fall from my hand, its imprint digging sharply into my palm. No one moved to stop them, not even Douglas and Vivian Monroe, who sat unmoving at the head table. I just stood there, watching their little drama unfold. The first time Julian crashed our wedding, I was furious. I shouted at him with every ounce of rage I had. This was supposed to be Eliza's and my day. I had planned it meticulously, and I couldn't let him ruin it. Red-eyed, I rushed to tackle Julian, intent on stopping him from stealing the woman who'd promised to be my wife. But our relatives blocked my path. Julian, standing protectively beside Eliza, smirked and said, "See? He flies off the handle at the smallest thing. He's bound to hurt you one day. Be glad I'm testing this for you. Otherwise, think of how much you'd suffer in the future." In that moment, the crowd turned against me. Their whispers painted me not as the groom, but as the villain. The voices surrounding me scolded me, saying it was just a test, and I had overreacted. It ended with me handing out a few hefty checks, and Eliza reluctantly agreeing to marry me again. The second time, I didn't shout. I didn't lose my temper. I fell to my knees, holding Eliza's dress, pleading with her not to leave. I loved her, and I recounted every single reason why. Julian pointed at me, disdainful, pathetic. "You think you can manipulate Eliza with this show of weakness? You're just a coward. What do you bring to the table besides clinging to her?" Once again, I was judged and condemned. Everyone there was one of Eliza's friends or relatives. I had no family, no one to stand by me. The verbal onslaught came from every side, and Eliza simply nestled into Julian's embrace, a sweet smile on her lips. Anger wasn't enough. Begging wasn't enough. Everything I did was wrong, so I chose to do nothing. I stood in silence, watching Julian's voice cut through the room once more. "See, Blake Carrington doesn't even care enough to fight for you. How could you marry a man like that? He's failed all 3 tests. He's not worth marrying." Anger failed. Pleading failed. Indifference failed. What do you want me to do? Eliza's eyes flicked back to me, and she threw the bouquet at my chest. "Blake, what are you doing just standing there? I'm being taken from you. You don't care at all? Do you? You never loved me." Her expression was a mixture of rage and frustration, but I merely brushed off the flowers clinging to my suit, straightened my tie, and walked toward the MC, taking the microphone from him. "Eliza, go. This wedding is over." When I finished speaking, the entire wedding venue fell into silence. Everyone assumed Eliza Monroe had me completely under her control, that no matter what she did, I wouldn't end things. Eliza snapped out of her shock quickly, her eyes narrowing. She grabbed a champagne glass and threw it at me, soaking my custom suit, one I had bought specifically for this day. "Blake Carrington, have you lost your mind?" she shouted. "How dare you say the wedding is off? You've got some nerve. You didn't even pass a single test, and now you say something like that. Tests, a single wedding costing tens of thousands of dollars. Dresses, photography, the MC, flowers, venues. 3 weddings costing millions in total." I laughed bitterly. Every cent came from me. Oh, so they were tests, not real weddings. Fine. All 3 weddings came to $450,000. Pay it back. Can you do that? Eliza's face fell. She couldn't possibly pay it back. Every doctor, every piece of jewelry she owned I paid for. The house her parents lived in, the car they drove, even their jobs at my company, they all came from me. She wouldn't be able to come up with that money, no matter what. The luxurious life Eliza enjoyed was funded solely by me. But none of that mattered to her. Instead, she doubled down, eyes blazing as she grabbed another glass and hurled it at me. Spending money on me is a privilege. What do you have besides a pile of cash you think that will tie me down? And now you dare to demand it back? I'll make you regret it. With that, she stormed out, wedding gown trailing behind her, and Julian Hart followed close, casting a triumphant smirk my way. As they exited, I watched, a hollow feeling taking root in my chest. 5 years of love, and this was who she really was. I glanced down at the wedding band still pressed into my palm, its outline sharp against my skin, and finally the tears fell. Eliza and Julian had been together before. When her family fell from wealth, Julian had walked away. That's when I came in, loving her fiercely, supporting her through everything. When she accepted me as her partner, I thought my love had won. Then Julian came back from overseas, ruining everything in an instant. Eliza fell for him again without a second thought. She stopped caring about me, my objections, everything except my money. She only cared about Julian. She used my love as a pawn for his gain, trampling over my feelings and dignity. The relationship had been decaying for a long time. I'd just been too naive to see it. I reclaimed the money I had given to her parents as a bride price and told the MC to clear the guests from the hall. I changed out of my soaked suit, grabbed my car keys, and prepared to head home when one of Eliza's relatives grabbed my arm, sneering. "Blake, so when's the next wedding?" he said, laughing at my expense. They thought it was a joke, that I would never truly leave her. I said nothing, walking straight to my car. There wouldn't be another wedding. Now you can watch the second part by pressing share and more. After that final scene, I walked out of the hall feeling empty, but without a trace of regret. With each step I took, the image of Eliza and Julian leaving together gnawed at me, making me relive every moment I'd invested in that relationship. I had given everything to see her happy, to build a stable future by her side, and she threw it all away without blinking. The worst part? I was surrounded by people who not only watched, but supported every humiliation she put me through. That's when I realized I had been nothing more than an investment to her, a convenient sponsor who financed her vanity and the comfort of her entire family. When I got home, I sat on the couch with my phone in hand. False apologies began to flood in from her family. "Blake, I know everything seems confusing right now, but Eliza still loves you. Give her another chance. She's just confused." Confused? Was she confused while she exchanged vows with Julian in the middle of our wedding ceremony? I laughed at myself, a bitter and cold laugh, as I blocked each of their numbers. I didn't want contact with anyone who saw me as a fool. The first step was to sever any financial ties. The next morning, I went straight to the bank and transferred all joint accounts to my name. I called my accountant and had her credit cards canceled. No warnings, no explanations. Not another cent would go to Eliza or her parasitic family. I also terminated the lease on her parents' house, and the car they drove was returned to the dealership. They were so used to luxury that they never thought to work or save, always assuming I would cover everything. Within days, desperate messages from Eliza started to come through. First, there were the apologies, filled with empty words and promises I knew to be false. Then came the veiled threats. "You can't leave us out on the street like this, Blake. Not after everything I did for you." I simply ignored them. Then she tried to manipulate me, claiming it was my fault for not being strong enough to pass the tests, that all of this was her way of ensuring our marriage would be solid. What kind of woman puts a man through this kind of humiliation 3 times? Mocking him in front of everyone just to test his love. Her relatives also began to pressure me, showing up at my office, yelling in the parking lot, demanding that I reconsider and get back together with Eliza. They looked at me as if I were some heartless monster for leaving them without their luxurious lifestyle. I started questioning how I'd ever let people like that into my life. But then, Eliza switched tactics. She decided to sue me, claiming she was entitled to part of my wealth since I had supported her for years. That was the last straw. I sat down with my lawyer, explained the situation, and he couldn't believe it. "Blake, she's literally trying to squeeze more money out of you after everything she's done. If it's war she wants, let's give it to her." And that's exactly what we did. I gathered proof of every cent I had invested in her and her family. The 3 wasted wedding ceremonies, expensive gifts, the dowry, even her parents' medical bills. I documented every expense, every transfer, everything I'd ever done for that ungrateful family. The court hearings were a spectacle. Eliza showed up with Julian as if his presence could intimidate me. In a desperate attempt to discredit me, she tried to portray our relationship as abusive, claiming I had financially manipulated her, when all I'd ever done was provide what they couldn't afford on their own. During the trial, Eliza cried, playing the victim, claiming I had ruined her life by cutting off financial support. Julian, beside her, kept that same smug smile as if this was just another victory. But with my lawyer's help and all the evidence I'd gathered, we were able to dismantle each one of her lies. In the end, the judge ruled that Eliza wouldn't get a single cent of my money. On the contrary, she was ordered to pay back a small portion of what I had spent on her and her family, which I knew she could never afford. Julian, who had looked so confident, began to lose his expression of arrogance as the sentence was read. He seemed to finally realize that the privilege of spending my money was, in fact, quite costly. I left the courthouse feeling a massive weight lifted from my shoulders. For too long, Eliza and her family had taken everything they could, and now they would have to deal with the consequences of their greed. Her parents, without my support, were soon evicted from their luxurious home and had to return to the tiny apartment where they had lived before I came into their lives. Eliza tried to keep up appearances, but soon the photos of fancy restaurants and international trips disappeared from her social media. Julian, her one true love, slowly started to drift away. Without the indirect financial support he'd been enjoying, he lost interest. Not long after, I heard rumors that Eliza was working at a small cafe, struggling to maintain even a semblance of her former life, while Julian simply disappeared. As for me, I finally found peace. I decided to travel, focus on my career, and enjoy life without leeches draining me dry. Eliza attempted to contact me a few times. I ignored every message, every attempt at reconciliation. She never admitted fault, but it didn't matter anymore. I watched from afar as she reaped the consequences of her own actions. And that's how, in peace and with a new life ahead of me, I finally moved on without looking back. The days after the trial brought me a strange calm, yet the feeling of injustice lingered. After everything Eliza and her family had put me through, their downfall didn't feel like enough. They lived like parasites, exploiting anyone who showed them the slightest generosity. And until now, they had always come out unscathed, ready to latch onto their next victim. This time, I was determined to change that. I didn't just want to cut off any source of money they might get from me. I wanted them to experience what it was like to lose everything, to hit rock bottom. First, I reviewed every document and contract that still tied me to Eliza and her family. Every loophole, every potential connection they could use to reach me or try to reverse the court's decision. I went through it meticulously and shut it down. Next, I turned my attention to those who had backed her up in court and helped shape her false image as a victim. The lawyers and friends who supported the absurd narrative that I financially controlled her became particular targets. I hired an excellent private investigator to dig up information on each of them. Gradually, their inconvenient secrets came to light. I found them engaged in shady dealings, favors, and other dishonorable acts. They were small errors, but I knew precisely where to share this information to create significant damage. Within months, Eliza's friends and allies began losing positions, contracts, and inevitably, respect. As for her parents, when I learned they had returned to their cramped and deteriorated apartment, I took it further. I discovered that they had never paid any fees or taxes while living in the house I rented for them. With a few calls and the right connections, a substantial bill was soon sent directly to their new address. And, as expected, they had no means to pay it. The result? Within weeks, they were threatened with eviction. Without wealthy friends to turn to or supportive relatives willing to help, they were on their own. They finally felt the weight of a reality they'd ignored while comfortably living off me. But for Eliza, I wanted something deeper. I knew her pride still kept her from facing what she'd truly lost. She'd always been obsessed with public image, with the status my position and money provided. So, I went after everything that could ruin her reputation. First, I ensured that her debts to me were registered and publicly exposed. Without knowing it, she ended up on a blacklist within our city's social circles. Invitations to important events stopped arriving, which, for someone like Eliza, was unbearable. And with discreet help from influential friends, I made sure her financial troubles were well known among those she used to associate with. She quickly went from glamorous socialite to a labeled opportunist who had finally gotten what she deserved. Little by little, Eliza tried to appear at smaller social events, accompanied by a new suitor each time, hoping to restore her image and perhaps find another investor to support her. But I was ready for this. Each man she got involved with started receiving anonymous tips about her relationship history and the court case she faced. These messages detailed every humiliation she put me through, every scandal, and every public loyalty test that turned my love into a public mockery. As expected, none of her suitors lasted long. They walked out of her life before she could even try to milk any money or support from them. Eliza soon realized her reputation was ruined, and that the chances of finding anyone willing to bankroll her lifestyle again were virtually zero. In one last act of desperation, she reached out to the few friends she had left. But they, too, were aware of her story, and now, without my financial support, she had nothing of value to offer them. And so, within a few months, Eliza became nearly invisible. Her once glamorous presence was reduced to that of a destitute woman, unable to accept that her days of luxury and power were over. I knew Eliza had hit rock bottom when I received a message from her, begging me to meet her one last time. Curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet, but this time, I was completely in control. I found Eliza in a simple cafe, and when I saw her, I barely recognized her. She looked worn out, her eyes tired and hollow, dressed in clothes she would never have dared wear before. The proud look she always carried was gone, and before me sat someone unrecognizable, broken, as if seeing herself for the first time. "Blake, please," she started, her voice trembling. "I know I made mistakes, that I was proud and maybe even unfair. But we had something real, didn't we?" I chuckled softly. The irony of hearing those words from her was almost too much to bear. "Something real?" I asked, with a calm that unsettled her. "You threw away anything real the moment you put me through your tests, Eliza. To you, I was just a way to maintain the life you wanted. Nothing more." She lowered her gaze, the mask she had maintained finally crumbling. I didn't know what I was doing. I was confused, Julian." She stopped, the mention of his name seeming to hurt her. "I made mistakes, but I'm willing to change, Blake. I just need a chance. We can rebuild everything, go back to how we were." I smiled one last time. "I spent years believing you were my partner, that we were building something together. But you used every moment, every drop of love I had, just to feed your own ego. And you know what's funny, Eliza? I really did love you. And because of that, I forgive you." She lifted her eyes, a flicker of hope lighting up in them, but I wasn't finished. "But forgiving you doesn't mean I'm taking you back. It only means I can move forward without the shadow of what you did to me." I stood up, leaving her there without looking back. From that moment on, my life took a new direction. I left the past behind and used every lesson I had learned to build something real and solid for myself. At peace, I walked toward the future, knowing that the sweetest revenge wasn't watching her suffer, but knowing she could no longer ruin anyone else's life the way she tried to ruin mine.